Hello, everyone. I'm Georgette Tan, Chair of BoardAgender, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to BoardAgender's 10th anniversary panel discussion. BoardAgender, as many of you know, is an initiative of the Singapore Council of Women's Organizations, the SCWO, and we are dedicated to advocating and advancing more women into senior leadership roles and boardrooms in Singapore. On behalf of my fellow BoardAgender committee members, thank you all for joining us. In particular, I'd like to do a special shout out for BoardAgender's past chairs, many of whom are on this call today. Juanita Woodward, Laura Huang, Trina Liang Lin, and Junie Fu. We are especially delighted to be organizing this event in conjunction and partnership with the 30% Club, a global initiative led by chairs and CEOs to increase gender diversity at board and senior management levels. Clearly, they are much aligned with BoardAgender's own objectives. Thanks to the support of the 30% Club, we have a global audience today. In addition to our audience from Singapore, we have attendees from 16 other countries and territories. Short of Antarctica, there's representation from every other continent on this globe. So thank you for joining in. We realize that for many of you, it's a rather inconvenient time. Over the last 10 years, BoardAgender drove research, including the launch of the first Singapore Board Diversity Report in 2011. And as part of our advocacy efforts, we also focused on campaigns and initiatives like the SG50 Champions of Change. We also organized panel discussions with our corporate and academic partners in order to draw attention to the issue and the need for gender equality at the board level. BoardAgender's work and efforts have contributed to improvements and increases, albeit small, of the numbers and percentage of women on boards in Singapore. The latest numbers from the Council of Board Diversity tell us that for the top 100 companies here in Singapore, we are at 17.6% female representation at the board. For statutory boards, that number stands at 27.5%, and the top 100 IPC nonprofits have 28.8% women on boards. Slowly and surely, we're getting the numbers. The trajectory is we're moving it in the right direction. But we also recognize that much more work needs to be done. We are only just getting started. And if the first 10 years was about defining and shedding light on the issue, then we need to now focus not just on doing more, but we need to, with a sense of urgency, accelerate the speed at which we provide women with the opportunity and access and elevate them into board roles. With this in mind, I'm very pleased to announce that BoardAgender is launching the inaugural BoardAgender mentoring program for aspiring women directors, where 10 board-ready women will be mentored by 10 seasoned board directors in a specially curated 6-month mentorship program. The program actually starts later this month, June. This mentoring program and today's panel discussion are just the first of BoardAgender's 10th anniversary activities, So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We're only just getting started. Speaking of getting started, let's get things going with our panel discussion. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our three amazing panelists today. First, Anne Cairns. As Executive Vice Chair, Anne represents MasterCard around the world, focusing on inclusion, diversity, and innovation. She is the Global Chair of the 30% Club, Chair of the Financial Alliance for Women, and also Chair of ICE Clear Europe. Anne and I were colleagues, and I know for a fact that she is a keen advocate of women's empowerment and a firm believer in mentoring and sponsoring women and to ensure that they are on the pathway to success. Our second panelist needs no introduction here in Singapore. Piyush is CEO and Director of the DBS Group. He's Vice Chair of the Institute of International Finance and sits on a number of boards in Singapore and internationally, including Singapore's Advisory Council on the Ethical Use of AI and Data, the McKinsey Advisory Council, Bretton Woods Committee, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Enterprise Singapore, and many others. Did I forget to mention that he's also on the board for the Council for Board Diversity? Our third panelist is Nicola Wakefield Evans. Nicola is an independent non-executive director of a number of companies and organizations, including Lendlease Group, Macquarie Group, Macquarie Bank, MetLife Australia, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and the University of New South Wales Foundation, to name but just a few. She is also chair of the 30% Club in Australia. To moderate the panel discussion today, let me introduce UOB Managing Director, leads with banks and non-financial institutions covering South and Southeast Asia, my fellow BoardAgender Committee member, Gyalpik Ho. Gyalpik, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Georgette. Hi, everybody. Good evening from Singapore. I'm Gyalpik. A warm welcome to all our participants around the world and to our panelists with us today. Anne Cairns joining us from UK, Nicola Wakefield Evans right out there in Australia, and of course Piyush, who is with us here in Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us on this panel on board diversity and in sharing your perspectives on how we might truly move beyond lip service for more women to be in senior leadership positions and for more women to be in the boardrooms. So if I may kickstart this panel, and to you, Anne, if I may just begin with you. In your capacity as the global chair of the 30% Club and the executive vice chair of MasterCard, you would have been directly behind the wheel in driving diversity across geographies, women leadership, on boards in some of the largest companies in the world. 30% Club has done a phenomenal job. The UK chapter has seen all male boards disappear across FTSE 350 since early this year. Can you share with us that journey? And perhaps importantly, to share with us how male chairs and CEOs featured up in this journey.
Thanks very much, Gyalpik. And, let's start with the men. It's all about the men. When the 30% Club started in 2011, Practically everyone who's a chair or a CEO of the FTSE 350 in Britain was a man. We went out and we spoke particularly to the chairs to start with, to say, don't you think it's a good idea to have more diversity at the top of your companies? And we found some great champions among the men. The head of the chair of British Aerospace, the chair of Lloyds Bank, and they sort of stood up and said, yes, we do think it's a good idea. We think the companies perform better if that happens. And they joined us and came on as our first champions. And they said, we're going to make a pledge, a target to reach at least 30% women on our boards. And they then rang up their friends who were also men that were at the top of their companies and said, join us. And so it really started in a very viral way, just as things work across the internet today. And one of the things that I think is so successful about it is that it was people actually saying they believed in it. In other words, they were going to create a culture inside their companies that achieved it, rather than being mandated a change. And I think that's really important. And so it's very much the male champions that have got us to where we are today.
Right. But when you first started with that, did you feel like you have to look for the one first male champion? And how did you then go, like, because you have to form that cohort? How did you approach that, and how did that then, create its own momentum?
Well, we did, we had more than one. We had several that stepped up. But when we're opening the 30% club around the world, we tend to try and look for someone to take the chair in the country who will be a champion. One of the most recent places we opened was Japan a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And there the chair is actually the CEO of Shiseido. And he is a fantastic champion in the marketplace. Japanese, of course, has many business colleagues. And even before Japan put itself on the map, they had already 45 senior members joined up, and a lot to do with his leadership, because he could just pick up the telephone and talk to, peers in the marketplace. And interestingly, Japan came in at a time they had 7% women on boards, and today they've got 13.9% in just 2 years. Wow. That just goes to show you the power of the leaders stepping up. And of course, we even saw, the head of the Olympic Committee step down because of things that he said in public about women in the boardroom. This tells you that there's a culture change going on, which I think is very welcome.
Right, that's so powerful. So literally leaning together with male allies, champions and leaders in the industry and their friends.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it always helps if the government's on your side. In Britain, the government didn't join in until about 2015. And then when they could see it was a great success, David Cameron said, well, we really like the 30% club. And of course, subsequently, Theresa May came into power, and she said, let's start asking all companies that have more than 250 employees to actually self-report their gender pay gap. And all of these things come together. Britain then, had things like the Hampton-Alexander Review created. So it's not just the 30%. I'm so sorry. That's my dog. It's not just
that's
the 30%.
Very normal. We're on a Zoom call. That's okay.
Gets quite excited in the background when I talk about the 30% club. It's not just one thing. It's not just one organization in any country. It's a whole raft of leaders, for example, Piyush in Singapore, coming together with other leaders like Georgette as the chair of BoardAgender, and making things happen inside your country and beyond.
Yeah, indeed. It is a community. Actually, let me just take this to Australia. So Nicola, you're obviously on multiple boards yourself, and you're also the chair of 30% Club Australia. And Australia has come a long way in the last 5 years in its board's composition. Not the easiest, and not least, it's because you had the support of the Australian Securities Exchange, the AICD, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, the federal government, the private sector. It was not easy, but having said that, today, women made up greater than 30% of ASX 200 boards. So could you just walk us through, talk to us on this progress, and how did male allyship feature up in Australia?
Thanks, Galpic. And firstly, can I just say how delighted I am to be part of this presentation, and also congratulations to BoardAgender.
Thank you.
10th anniversary. We've been very excited by it, and having lived and worked in Hong Kong, I've known about BoardAgender ever since you started. So it's just a real privilege to be here. So you're right, Galpic. Australia's been a really interesting story because we're a very, very conservative country. And when the 30% Club was formed in Australia in 2015, we only had 19% of women on our top 200 boards on the ASX 200. And that had crawled up from 9% from 2009. But we had some really interesting intersections happen around about that time. 2010, the Australian Stock Exchange released their first draft, the first edition of the corporate governance principles, which are corporate governance principles that Australian listed companies have to abide by. They're not rules like stock exchange listing rules are, but you do need to report against the principles. And in the first edition, they had a diversity statement around the need to increase diversity on boards. There's been 4 different editions now. The last one, which was released in 2019, has a requirement that boards should aspire to 30%, which aligned very much with the work that the 30% Club's doing. The AICD then announced in 2014 that its goal for its members, who are all of the directors on Australian companies, were that boards of any kind, so listed, non-listed, not-for-profit, government, etc., big family companies, big private companies, should aspire to 30%. And in fact, recently the AICD has moved to 40-40-20, which is a big debate happening in Australia at the moment. And then we formed the 30% Club. And to follow, I mean, very much like the story in the UK, we invited as members the chairs of the ASX 200, the top 200 companies. That was the very first thing we did, and we personally contacted every chair of those 200 companies to talk about what our goal was. Our initial goal was to get to 30% by the end of 2018. We actually got there in 2019. And I think the thing that struck me the most was just how powerful it was to get that group together. We followed it up with research, with meetings, with panels, and we tried to connect as many of them as possible. We also picked some quite powerful chairs, the chairs of our 4 big banks, for example, the then chair of Macquarie Bank, who was very, very instrumental in assisting us. And part of that was that my predecessor, Patricia Cross, and I both sat on his board. So we gave him a lot of pressure to help us, and he was absolutely fantastic. And that's where the male allyship comes in. We absolutely needed them to be part of helping us get to where we are. So that intersection was really important. We also we have a very vibrant investor committee as part of the 30% Club. And within the first 12 months, they signed a charter where they all agreed that they would focus on companies that had no women on their boards, and they would vote against any male director coming up for re-election if there was no female candidate or no women on the board. And that was very powerful. And over a 2-year period, that's where we saw our numbers really shoot up past 23%. We enlisted the help of the big recruitment companies, the big investment banks and private equity firms that operate in Australia. We have a very, very big focus on research and statistics. We report every quarter, and we get a lot of publicity right across the print and the TV and radio press in Australia. So what we decided to do was just make sure we had the numbers and that we kept pushing them out there. And that had the impact of, it sort of challenged the chairs, but it provided a really tense competitive atmosphere. And so we reached 30% in 5 years, which we think for Australia was a very big achievement. And we're now at 33% for the ASX 200, and we've just reached 30% for the ASX 300. And as of the end of April, we were at 27.2% for the top 500 companies. So we've had a huge change over the last 6 to 7 years in Australia, and it's been because of so many people and organisations, from governments, the stock exchange, AICD, investors, all throwing their weight behind the cause.
Indeed. Well, that's an admirable effort and really admirable progress. Thanks for sharing that. Piyush, if I may now come to you, we heard it from Anne as well as Nicola, how important male allyship is. And of course, with you as the group CEO of DBS and on multiple boards and advisory councils, you are a firm supporter of gender diversity. DBS has a very strong female bench strength at the leadership level.
In fact, I say, Gupta, the women run this bank, the rest of us just hang around.
Yeah, and of course, you know, you're on the Bloomberg Equality Index for the 4th year running, so lots of good stuff there.
Yeah, but Gupta, the good stuff is good. I've got bad news, actually. Let me start with, unlike Anne and Nicola, you know, the problem with Singapore doesn't have a great story. So I joined the Council for Board Diversity 2 years ago. We first set it up. And we were running at 15-16% at that time. We gave ourselves a target to get to 20% by end of 2020. And we got to 17 and change. So we moved like 1.5% in 2 years, which was a shame. You know, I mean, we couldn't even get to a 20% number. And here, you know, Anne and Nicola talk about 30 and 33 and 35%. Now, as we look back, there, I guess, 2 cultural challenges. So not excuses, but I think some of it comes from there. One is there are a lot of family-owned businesses in this part of the world. And family-owned businesses by the nature have very patriarchal arrangements. And so if you cannot convince the patriarch, who oftentimes is, you know, 80 years old and owns the business, it's very hard to make meaningful progress. And we've been coming up against that. So that's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is a lot of the companies listed in Singapore who are part of our universe, they tend to be not Singaporean companies. So we have a lot of companies from mainland China, a lot of companies from Indonesia, a lot of companies from the region. And we found it particularly hard making progress with some of these companies as well. So let me first start with that. You know, we made a lot of endeavors. We're not happy with where we are. However, let me tell you the 2 or 3 things which, to my mind, are the right things to do. Both Anne and Nicola spoke about that. And that's where we're seeing, you know, the early glimmers of success. The first is getting male sponsorship. By the way, I don't like the allyship word. Maybe it's a standard, first time I've come across it, frankly. But, you know, allies are, you know, they can be supporters. I think you need sponsors. I think you need people who are willing to take an active role in participating and pushing the agenda. You know, this is the difference between being a chicken and being a pig. A chicken is an ally, a pig is committed. You know, you're the sausage. I found that getting sponsors, particularly not just chairman, but nominating committee heads, is really, really helpful. And so in the last year, as we started identifying individual chairs and individual nominating committee heads, we started corralling them and getting them for meetings one-on-one with a few of us. And frankly, making sure they understood the agenda and getting them on site. I found also that, and so I read a piece of research which really blew me away recently. One of my colleagues pulled it out for me. The Cantor, you know, Reykjavik Leadership Index research very recently. It pointed out that the people who are most averse to female participation are actually the young people. And I sort of started trying to figure intuitively, why would this be the case? And a lot of the young guys probably see women as competitive threats. Whereas the people who are biggest sponsors are people who have daughters. Anybody who's got a daughter believes the daughter can conquer the world. So if you go and figure out people and get sponsors, people who have daughters, people who want to be brand ambassadors themselves, people who have an agenda for trying to grow a company, it's helpful. I think also finding CEO sponsors is helpful because they can really sponsor individual women in their companies to go out and sponsor them for board roles. I do that the whole time. Every one of my, not just my 1-downs, but even many of my 2-downs, I actively go and market them for board roles. And because, you know, I have credibility, I go and tell people there's a fantastic board candidate, you must take her, right? So I think you need sponsors of that nature. So I think sponsorship is really important. And between chairs, NC heads, and oftentimes CEOs, I think that's one thing that helps. A second thing we found early days that, you know, the standard refrain I hear when we go and talk to people is, oh, but we can't find the women, right? I mean, it's like the world didn't have 50% women, right? So, but what we started doing is we started creating a short list of women, and then we pre-screen and meet them. So I personally sat in meetings and I met, you know, half a dozen women each time to try and say, oh, people I didn't know. But then when I go to NC chairs or this, I say, look, I've met these women. And I think these women are good because of 1, 2, 3, and knowing a board profile, you should go consider. So I think these sponsors are actively engaged at that level. Hopefully that will allow us to make better progress than we've been able to do so far in Singapore. So I think there's something that we want to work harder on. But the other thing which I think both Anne talked about it and Nicola, at the end of the day, I also believe that there is an active role for government support and people pressure. You know, I think this thing requires more energy than just comes from willingness and people, you know, suddenly, you know, finding religion. So using data, I don't want to, maybe not quite naming and shaming, but actually putting pressure on people through media, through public, this thing, reflecting on performance is important. So at the last thing recently, we got the president of the country, Halima Yaqub, to come out and say we're disappointed with the fact that the country hasn't made progress. And we got all of the ministers from the cabinet to come out and say, look, we need to do this. Now, once you start hearing from leadership and political figures, that starts ratcheting up the pressure on individual companies who are not there yet. So I do think you need media support, PR support, and you need political and government support to ante up the stakes, if you will.
Right. And just on that, right, but when it comes into board, you know, when it comes into board, when the next board seat comes up, the guys at that board might decide that, you know, it's still easier if I can get under the radar. It's still easier, especially with the points that you said, a lot of these are family-owned organizations, right? Is it easier to just recommend the next person I know best within my network and therefore take on that empty seat?
Yeah, but it is easier, and that's the problem. So how do you know, get pressure on these family owners and all this thing to feel the heat? I mean, that's very honestly, you got to put some heat on people. You can't just rely on all of the people who are, you know, 80 years old suddenly, like I said, changing. Some do. Some listen to cogent arguments. Some listen to the fact that you get better performance if you have a diverse board, etc. But some don't. And so the only way to handle that is to my mind, like I said, ratchet up the heat. And so the heat, if I go and talk to them, you know, you can make some headway. I know many of them, they're, you know, professional colleagues, etc. But it's very different if a minister picks up the phone or somebody in government leadership, or it's featured in the newspaper that XYZ company is not up to snuff. That really starts engaging because that positions them in bad light. So I think you need to get there.
Right. So all round pressure in a way, not so much shaming, but definitely getting that spotlight on it.
Well, yes, but that's a better way to say it, I guess. Yes.
A better way to say it. Okay. Just on that, and you know, of course, today's world, like we said, you know, we work from home, we have all this COVID situation. Does that change that equation, you know, for a woman who wants to get visibility, you know, even if all that radar is on them, is it harder for them to come on?
Well, it's harder and easier, you know, depending on what you're doing. For example, we can convene something like this where I'm in London, Nicola's in Australia, Piyush and the rest of you are in Singapore, and we can get global audiences together. And Piyush is absolutely right that you've got to use everything that you can do to heighten the situation. And the 30% Club is a campaign. And last week, we actually hosted some of our global chairs and CEOs, about 150 of them showed up to something that I was hosting with Melinda Gates in America. And I think, you know, that is a very positive thing. Now, the negative side, and we were just talking about this before we came online, Piyush and I know each other for years, and we're saying, isn't it awful that we're not flying around the world, you know, chatting to the business leaders that we know and the country leaders, and isn't it such a different business environment? I think if you know somebody, you can connect quite well through this media. If you don't know people, it's very difficult. And so I do think that the whole networking side has been inhibited in many ways through this. But I'm absolutely with him when it comes to pick your targets and go for convincing people as well. I love the idea, by the way, Piyush, about, you know, target people who are leading the NOMCO on boards, because they are helping select the next board members. In the UK, 2 weeks ago, I actually called together 20 senior headhunters. All the usual suspects of the global companies, you know, came in, your Heidrick and Struggles, your Russell Reynolds, your Egon Zenders, all these guys. And then the specialists started to come in, your Sapphires and so on. And you know, sat round, and many of them, by the way, the senior partners for the board practices were women. And we sat there and said, okay, you know, how are we going to make even more progress? How are you going to field diverse candidates? Because actually we're talking about ethnicity now as well in the UK. And I think that you've got to use every possible group that you can use and reach into to change things. So it's quite difficult for men and women now, you know, to get the networking going. My daughter's 27 and just joined Amazon in June, and has been working in a virtual environment. I mean, her boss, you know, she's in London, her boss is in Milan. How do you actually sort of get that rapport, that chemistry going between you and the people that are working for you if you can't actually meet? And that's just a fact. I think it's really difficult.
Yeah, right. You know, the other group, which actually Nicola mentioned, I should have touched on it. I think that's very powerful, are the asset owners, the investors.
That's right.
If you look at the power and clout of the investors to bring the ESG agenda, but mostly environment, right? So carbon, climate, etc., it's been massive in the last few years because they genuinely have clout. They vote with their pockets. I think we need to get the investors more engaged, the asset owners more engaged with the diversity agenda. Some do, but not adequately. In Singapore, one of the constituencies that we've now worked with, and they're actually pushing it for helping us push this thing now, is Temasek. Now, Temasek is the biggest shareholder in half the Singapore companies. And, you know, till recently, we were just not leveraging Temasek's ownership to be able to push the boards and push the chairman and the nominating committees in a particular direction. I think that's very important.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, there has been a lot of conversation around the investor community, whether is it the sovereign wealth funds or whether is it the likes of Goldman, who has gone out there and said, you know, I'm not going to bring any company public if there is no one single diverse board member on your company. So there has been a lot of pressure. Do you feel like this might be the one critical pull that we really need to activate in order to drive this message home? How important is this pool, and how can we activate it even more beyond Temasek? How do we get into that global investor pool who is beginning to start thinking about this?
Sorry.
And my point is not really the important investor pool. I think the timing is perfect because you look at the business leaders roundtable, this thing in the US. So you look at several other investor communities around the world. The recognition in a post-pandemic world that it's not just E, but S as well, which is important, and the G that's important, is dawned on a lot of investors. And so they're now actively pushing the agenda of, you know, what you're trying to do to create a better society and create better representation. So I think it's an important community, and I think the timing is good to push the conversation and dialogue with this investor group. Sorry, Anne, you were saying something.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree, Piyush, and Nicola can jump in here because actually at the 30% Club, we have super active investor teams, and we've got trillions and trillions of asset under management. Most of the investors are part of the 30% Club. And we've been mobilizing them around the world through the club to actually go in and have those conversations and vote at shareholder meetings and so on. Nicola, maybe you want to jump in there.
Sure. So I'm leading a group of global chairs in the 30% club to identify who the top 10 of the different asset classes, plus the proxy advisors. They're very important in most markets as well, because what we want to do is elevate the discussion from individual countries to a global discussion, because we then think that if they're all on the same page, they can then come back into jurisdictions like Singapore, like Malaysia, you know, particularly like Japan, for example, and wield their influence, because they have been several 30% club chapters, including Australia, have been very successful because of the clout and the influence that the investors have brought to bear on chairs, CEOs and chairs of non-committees of our listed companies. And the other, I mean, each jurisdiction is different. In Australia, we've got our Temasek equivalent is ACSI, which is the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. They've been absolutely fantastic. We've got a chair there who is so passionate about diversity. He threw his weight behind us as soon as we started, and they've been very vocal. And I've often called out the fact that we were very successful quite quickly because of our investor support. I also want to call out, Piyush and Gaupik, don't underestimate the stock exchanges as well. I think that the role that the ASX has played in Australia in having very concrete diversity requirements, not quotas and not listing rules that if you breach you're in trouble, but very high profile targets that you must report against, have been very influential as well. And I would be encouraging the Singapore Stock Exchange, for example, to look at what Australia's done and maybe think about, because I think that's, we have a lot of very interesting companies. One of our companies, which is a family-owned company, Fortescue Minerals, is at 40% and has a female CEO. But it's a founder company and very successful on the stock exchange. And Andrew Forrest has been very vocal in his support, for example, for diversity, and he's put his words into action. So I think if you can catalyse some of those groups, it's it will be very powerful.
Yeah.
Well, NASDAQ are doing the same, aren't they? They're saying, you know, that they're sort of making rules about who they're listing and so forth.
That's right.
Right. Now, just on that point on targets, right? So Piyush, just to your point, Singapore, you know, we kind of fall short on that number, and in 2020, we're trying to do our best around it. We have seen in some EU countries, you know, of which quota obviously, you know, has gone in there, and they've done some really good numbers, whether is it France, whether is it Germany, in terms of their corporate boards. Would we think that at some point, if this doesn't move, we should really be thinking about quotas? Or are we thinking that targets, like in the case of Australia, might be the right path to go? And then you could share your view too.
I'm quite happy to, put the cat among the pigeons, because I know this has got extreme views from both sides. A lot of women don't like being a quota. And a lot of, companies, including stock exchanges, are reluctant to put quotas. I'm actually of the camp that, you manage what you measure, and from time to time, it is appropriate to set up targets and quotas. And I think if you look at some of the outcomes in countries in Europe, France is an example, some Scandinavian countries which actually put quotas to 40, 42, 45%, very rapidly. So I think quotas could have a role to play, and you don't need to have quotas for life, but for periods of time to accelerate and focus attention, I don't necessarily think that that's necessarily a bad thing. What you have to guard with quotas, though, is people then tend to game the system. So when India put quotas in, Mukesh Ambani got his wife Neeta Ambani to join the board. Now, if you don't put adequate safeguards, then you wind up gaming the system, and that can actually prove detrimental, because you get a female board member on board this thing who's really not adequately equipped and does not bring value, and then that starts to empower the naysayers and say, oh well, they really don't bring value. So if you go down that path, you got to put appropriate safeguards to make sure it's a short-term not a long-term phenomena, that you make sure that there is a, quality, this thing, that you're not just filling a quota for quota's sake, etc. So it's not straightforward. But my own view is, in some situations, in some countries, it might merit looking at.
Yeah. And what about your view on quotas and targets?
Well, look, I'm actually not disagreeing with Piyush on this, because I think it's a cultural thing. In Britain, we responded much better to the idea of having a target that we could go for. We felt it was more aspirational than being told what to do. Other cultures may find it easier just to follow rules. In the 30% club, we like the aspirational targets, because we kind of go like, that will affect the culture. People are actually buying into it from the get-go, and they're saying so. And we like that model. So we would prefer that model, but I'm not saying that it would work every single place in the world. There could be places where you would need a quota to actually cause the change. And I'm recognizing that, and also saying I like the short-term comment. Now, on the term comment, the other thing that struck me is that having term limits for board seats is really important. And it can actually cause an acceleration of having diverse board members. For example, in Japan, as in Britain, you have 3-year term limits, and then you're re-voted onto the board. And in Britain, you have to stop after 9 years, though many people leave before the 9 years. In America, you can be on a board ad infinitum. If you actually have a situation where you have no term limits, very hard to actually get change. So I think these kind of things are really important as well.
Yeah, totally. Just one other thing that I also want to touch on the profitability, on the bottom line. When these gender diversity conversations hits the bottom line, it tends to then drive action. How real is this? How real is it that diversity really would hit the bottom line, and therefore the chairs and the CEOs would really take action? What is that view?
Well, I mean, the thing is, let's go back to the data. So there's a lot of data around the world on this. McKinsey's the most often quoted data source. And they say companies that are in the top quartile of diversity in their management teams and at their boards are outperforming the bottom quartile by 25%. Now, you could say, is that cause and effect? I don't know. It might just be that the best companies in the world are doing this. But, the data is out there to look at, and that is what the investors are looking at when they're saying, we want change because we think it will make the companies perform better and be more sustainable. I mean, the other thing is, Piyush mentioned earlier about women are half the human race. If we look at all of the people graduating from university today, in many countries, that's kind of 50-50. In a lot of countries, it's actually more women than men, by the way. What kind of business leaders would we be if we said, oh yeah, well, that's all very well, but we're only going to choose people from half the graduating class? I mean, we'd be absolutely nuts to do that. None of us are doing that at the entry level. And yet we've got people doing it at the top of companies. I'm only going to choose from half the human race to run this company. How can you possibly have the best talent? It makes absolutely zero sense. So yeah, really,
that is, to my mind, the most compelling argument. I'll come back to this thing, but it's like, to me, if you had to go fishing, you have one pond which is exhausted of fish, and the other pond which is equally in size, 50%, right? It is unfished. Where are you going to go fish? You go fish in the pond which is like stocked with fish and has not been fished in, right? So why would you think differently for talent? You want to go where the talent is equally abundant and is not being tapped into. And to me, that's what drives performance. That you can get really high quality talent because it's just not being tapped into. So frankly, I think that's a better thing. The second thing, I got to tell you, I've got to speak my book, which is talk to my this thing. It's not entirely clear to me the general thing that women will always be better leaders or women make better this thing is necessarily proven. I've talked myself out of a job if I'd say any woman would come and always do a better job than I would. I think the logic that women think horizontally, men think, vertically, or men are action and women are EQ, IQ. I've seen a lot of women who also don't have EQ, and I've seen a lot of men who are quite sensitive to the issues. So I'm not necessarily convinced that the innate nature of human beings and genders drives out performance in certain categories. But I am a big believer in Anne's argument that, you have 50% of the world you're not tapping into. You definitely will get better talent because there's so much more people that you never tapped into in the first place.
Right. So you do think that diversity at that senior level in your team actually drives the performance of DBS?
Of course, without a doubt. By the way, it's not just going back to this, it's not just gender diversity. I think, for example, to me, the ethnic diversity, even country diversity, we're in several countries. Countries behave differently. Cultures are different. So if China is a big market for me, if I don't have somebody who understands mainland China and how people there think and how people there behave, I'm missing something. Or India, or certain ethnic groups, they tend to think and behave certain. So I think making sure you have a balanced representation of the marketplaces you're in, the customer groups you want to deal with, all of these things matter a lot to creating the right performance metrics. Gender says that half the population in the world are women. And I can tell you, women in many issues and many things, because their life experiences are different. They think differently, they have to. So why would you not have women who can then tell us, this is relate and emote with how women think?
Yeah.
Can I just add two other perspectives?
Yes.
One is that you need to have women in leadership, in my view, to be able to recruit a diverse array of employees. I think that's really important, particularly if you want to get the best and brightest women into your organisation. Women, particularly, and I'm finding this for the younger generation, are discarding companies where they can't see the possibility for advancement because there are no women at the top. And I think that's one of the my big drivers for having increased numbers of women in leadership. And the other one, to pick up both Piyush and Anne's points, is you must have diverse voices at the leadership table. You have to have diverse thinkers, because if you have everybody who thinks the same, who looks the same, you're not going to get good business outcomes. And that's why it's so important to have a diverse group of people who are in leadership to drive that diversity. It's beyond gender in my view. And we're seeing that globally.
Yeah. I mean, in the many geographies that we are in, or even just in small Singapore, where it is obviously multiracial, and it's just different, right? Or the different makeup of it. But
That's
just
right.
in terms of earlier conversation around sponsorship, the importance of sponsorship, and just translating that back into the fact that when we have diversity at the board level, is of course good, it's important with diverse voices, but what about inclusion? How do we translate that to inclusion at the board level, at the senior management level, such that decisions really can be taken? It is not just a PR exercise of numbers and stats that we push out there into the press and getting some headlines. How do we do that so that fundamentally real decisions can be made and changes can be done, whether at the organizational level or at the country level?
So that's where the 30% club, the rationale for 30% comes into it, because we know that if there's only one woman at the board table, her voice it's difficult for her to be heard.
Yeah.
There are two, it gets a bit better, but if there's 30%, you're starting to get a different lens and a different conversation. And it's the same on the executive side. It's the same in government. I mean, we're having a big debate in Australia because we don't have enough women in Parliament, both in our governing side and in the opposition, although we've got 2 female state premiers. So you need to have, I think, a minimum of 30% with an aspiration to get to 40% or even 50%. And that's where you start to make, that's where the change comes. And that's where you get your point of decisions being made from different perspectives. But you've got to have more than just one. It's got to be a much greater collective.
Right. And any comments on that one? How do you get real inclusion?
Well, I mean, I think, look, Piyush started to go into the whole stakeholder management earlier and saying, You've got to basically get people around the table that understand the countries you're in, the cultures that you're operating, the customers that you serve. I mean, in my business, in MasterCard, 85% of the day-to-day buying decisions are made by women, by the way. On a global basis. That's the stats that we look at. And therefore, if you don't include their views in the way that you design products and you market them and so on, you'd be a pretty poor payments company, quite honestly. So I think that you've got to think of it in all aspects of your stakeholder management. And as Nicola said, that's the whole philosophy behind 30%, that you've actually you've stopped being a minority. Your voice is actually heard, not just from individuals, but in terms of, you know, what impact it has around the table. And so I just think it's not just the boardroom that you have to worry about this in. It's in, what do your employees look like? You know, what communities are you serving? What are you actually saying to your customers out in the markets? And this affects the whole ESG agenda, by the way. So I think once you've got sort of the diverse voices around the table, it's natural to go for inclusion. But having said that, your business is going to drive you that way anyway. Otherwise, you're just not going to build a sustainable business longer term.
Right. No, just on that. So we want to do that, but fundamentally what we want to get to is the diversity of thought, right? At the end of the day, we want to have inclusion, we want to have diversity of thought. So Piyush, to you, how do we hire for diversity of thought? What do we look for? What do you look for?
So let me first caveat that a little bit, Yopik. I think it's important to have diversity, but I think diversity for diversity's sake might not always suit the bill. In my own case, I believe we've always had a majority of bankers on our board. Now, you could argue that that's not good. I should have people from different disciplines, a lawyer, an accountant, a marketer, and I'm sure that would help. But I also think banking is not a straightforward subject. And the fact that we have people on the board who know banking, who understand the constructs of market risk and credit risk and, you know, AML and KYC, etc., and I don't have to go through explaining to them every time what the issues are, that's very, very beneficial. They instinctively understand the nature of the business and they can help guide the business much better than people who've got no domain knowledge at all. So I think we need to balance this need for diversity of thought with making sure you get people who have domain knowledge and can take not just a policeman role on the board, but can take a strategic role on the board, help drive business agendas and strategies. So I wouldn't discount the need for some of the domain knowledge and deep expertise that you need to have in some cases. So that's one thing. The second part, how do you get people, and what do you look for in diversity? I think you're looking for life experiences. Finally, what forms your views? What causes you to have a point of view? It's a function of how you grew up, where you grew up, you know, where you train, what kind of work you do, and what kind of experiences you built along the way. So to me, the most important thing to try and figure out, how do you get people with a diversity of life experiences and job experiences? Because you can pretty much say they will think slightly differently. That's why I said, you bring a woman in, you know, she'll think slightly differently because her life experiences have been very different from a guy's life experiences and so on. So I think you need to be looking for that. People who have different sets of life experiences that they can bring to bear in different kinds of circumstances.
Right, right. Thanks for that. Nicola, do you have anything else on that point? How does it look like for Australia in terms of that?
So we're having a very interesting debate at the moment, Gaupik, looking at what the boards of the future, the capability of the boards of the future. There's a very big, there's often been, I mean, the critics of what we do at the 30% Club in Australia say, oh, you really only need ex-CEOs or ex-CFOs on a board. They're the people with the right experience. Whereas we're very much pushing by doing research, and we've got 2 universities and 2 of the big global consulting firms helping us, identifying, to your point, how do you get diversity of thought? What skills do directors need to lead our companies in the future? Do we need more people? I mean, very few of our non-executive directors of the ASX 200 come out of HR, for example. There are very few people who've run people divisions who actually elevate up onto the boards. very few who run marketing, communications. And interestingly, they are the positions in our companies that women tend to get to in senior positions. So we're trying to unpick this theme in Australia that you need to be a CEO or you need to run something to have the right capability for a board. So we're really trying to dig deep into questioning what boards of the future, how they should be made up, what capability, what really does diversity of thought mean. You know, I've sat on a board where everybody was a CEO. That's not a very pleasant experience, because everybody tends to start by saying, when I was a CEO.
That's the introduction. I'm a CEO.
I've got a word in edgeways.
So it's you know, I think there's some really interesting research that's being done globally on this issue, and particularly post-pandemic. We know that our workplaces are changing. We know that people are going to have different expectations about how their organisations are managed, and boards need to step up to that challenge and change as a result.
Right.
I agree, by the way. I'm the chairman of Ice Clear Europe, which is one of the biggest clearing houses in the world. It's part of Intercontinental Exchange Group, which owns the New York Stock Exchange. And one of the most valuable people on my board, happens to be a woman, is an ex-regulatory lawyer from Clifford Chance. Because quite honestly, the level of regulation as we have as a global clearinghouse, from the College of Regulators, starting with the Bank of England and, you know, and so on, it's wonderful to have a regulatory lawyer on your board. So.
Right. Thanks for that. Okay, I just wanted to go to a few questions from the participants, because we have lots of questions, but just addressing a few of them. So perhaps to Nicola, back to Nicola, could you just advise and share your views? What does a gender inclusive workplace look like? You know, from all the boards that you sit on, how does that look like for you?
So it looks like a place that's a safe place, which I think is really important for inclusion.
Yep.
Having the right policy settings, and also being inclusive for all genders, transgender, people from different cultures, feeling that they can bring their whole person to work, and not feeling that they have to leave either their religion behind or their gender behind. That they can be who they are at work. I think that's really important, and that sort of goes hand in hand with safety as well, but also providing opportunity for everybody. So everybody should have the same opportunity to advance, to be assessed, to be promoted, to be paid, and not have inequality in payment. I mean, we've got a big gender pay gap in Australia that we're trying very, very hard. And if it doesn't change, the government has said that they will legislate with fines. So that's something that may come into Australia in the near future. Inclusiveness also means, you know, being able to having the right environment to listen to different views and respecting them. Having very concrete sexual harassment and anti-bullying policies. So it's actually a very holistic look of how a workplace operates and is run.
Right. Okay. I have another question, and this question is to Anne directly. It asks, the question says, what is the greatest challenge that you see in light of COVID from an inclusion and innovation perspective?
Well, I think that what we've seen during COVID is that around the world, women have been bearing the things like educating their kids at home more than men have. And there's lots of data out there. I mean, even female professors are publishing less papers than male professors right now because of this sort of family burden. And I think what then that's highlighted is that we haven't solved childcare globally. And it's something that we've really got to address. Now, I'm not saying you can solve it globally, but what I think you can do is you can look at it inside your own organization, and you can look at it inside your own country and decide, you know, what you're going to do to create some sort of level playing field for men and women about this. In MasterCard, we decided to roll out global maternity and paternity leave everywhere in the world in over 200 countries. 4 months full paid leave. And I like that, because as a manager, you're not looking at a young woman thinking, oh, she's going to go and have a baby. You're looking at a person thinking they're going to be a parent. And that changes the levels the playing field right away. And obviously that applies to same-sex couples and so on. But things like in your company, having things like emergency childcare, you know, how much that would ease the burden, even when the parents are sharing, that you get up in the morning, something happens, you know, to your support, it disappears, but you can still get on with your life and do your job and so on. So I think there's a long debate that's actually going to happen about this. And probably the most, you know, one of the worst countries in the world is actually America. And it's been quite intense in America, so much so that a quarter of the women interviewed, corporate women in America, are talking about stepping back from their careers right now. So I think that we've got a real problem. I think that we could go backwards. We are going backwards this year. And I think it's up to companies and governments to think what they need to do to stop, to arrest that regression.
Right, right. Okay, and another question that I wanted to just put it to Piyush, this relates to STEM, and I know you're very passionate about STEM and women in STEM and tech. So here it says, the classic negative stereotype that women are not capable in STEM has been perpetuated for generations. How do we break and recreate the diversity culture with today's generation? So to the young people. And then back to the point earlier, we said that maybe it's the young people that don't want diversity. So this question goes, how do we really see that view and perspective within our younger people? And we do have some university students on this call, by the way.
Yeah. So, you know, here's what we've been doing. It's, by the way, it's true. Our ratio of women is the poorest in technology, in IT. Engineers are the poorest. And so one of my women engineers, she's fantastic, Su Chu, she's been leading the agenda on trying to see how we can dial up women in engineering disciplines. So we started focusing on really looking for women to hire. We first launched this program. We called it Hacker and Her, but then for some reason we figured it wasn't politically correct. So, but we basically run we hire people through we hacks. We give them like, 7-8 hour long programs, and you got to program and hack and so on. But we started focusing these so only women could apply. Just last week, we made an announcement that we're going to be looking for a similar thing, 150 roles in Singapore, where only women candidates can apply. So we're being very targeted to make sure that we look for women actively, we make it possible for women to come on board. And we've created a huge support system for women engineers in the company to help women prosper. I think role modeling is very important. I think when people see women doing well and people see women in the discipline getting to leadership positions, then more women raise their hands and say, hey, I think I can do that and I want to be there. Yeah. So I think there's a role from the company downwards that you can play. But the bigger role we got to focus on is at the school levels. Just not enough girls are going into STEM disciplines. And therefore, the parallel thing we're doing is beginning to work with schools and colleges to help with programming and teaching girls to program. There are large numbers of this thing where we're focused on helping girls to say it's easy, you can do it and get into the discipline. Our big problem is when you go to the universities, you go to the polytechnics, you're not finding enough women who've taken engineering and computer science and data science subjects. And therefore, the pool is not big enough. So we're now focused on saying, how do you increase the size of the pool by working proactively and showing women it's possible to do? And to me, the best way is role modeling. When women engineers go out and say, hey, this is a career I made and I could do it, that really starts, that showcase really starts making it easier for other people to recognize that they could do it too.
Yeah, well, yeah, totally. I think we have to start from the young. I think it needs to come more from there. That generation view needs to change. But senior leadership obviously is very, very important, and the whole sector and the whole dynamics of the ecosystem. Now, before I let all three of you go, because I know it's coming up to that time now, just one final question to each of our panelists. It's been a pretty hard journey. We see that right across the world. We all know women leadership, board diversity. You know, it's more than just words. It's about inclusion. It's about diversity of thought. It's about hiring and making sure those views gets through at the highest level so the right decisions are being made. Having said that, lots still needs to be done, no matter which geography you might be, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Australia, UK, wherever that might be. Now, for yourself, looking at this, are you still hopeful that we can really tangibly move the needle on board diversity and women leadership? What is your personal hope in this? Perhaps if I can start with you, Nicola.
I'm naturally a very optimistic person, and I think the evidence is there that we've seen movement, and the 30% club formation in the UK over 10 years ago really catalysed this space. So I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to see. And look, as Anne said, with her example with Japan, I sat on one of a listed Japanese subsidiary, and I would never have thought that Japan would move as quickly as it has. So I'm hopeful we'll get there. We have to. Women represent 50% of the population. We've all made comments about how it's so vital that we have a place in leadership, that our voices are heard, that our diverse thinking is part of leadership decision making. And once you link all of that to economic prosperity for companies, then I think you actually get rid of the myths and some of the barriers that have held women back. And the other thing I just want to call out, we work with the Middle East, with a lot of Middle Eastern countries at the 30% club, and they're an unlikely place where you would see change, and we are seeing change. And I'm very hopeful that we'll still see great strides in gender diversity and gender leadership going forward.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. What about you, Piyush? What is that view? Are you hopeful?
Very hopeful.
Despite the challenges.
Very hopeful. I have a 31-year-old daughter who lives in London, and you know, she works with the bank, and I have seen no reason why she's not going to be CEO of this bank. So I am very hopeful. I think some of the best talent we have coming through our own system are the women at every level, and all the way up to our senior leadership team. I went in, I said, you know, women run DBS, and most of our senior leadership women, they're all on both local and international boards. I actively put them on boards. I think it's very powerful because it helps the company to improve their own development and their, able to think. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I think the moves, I was very chuffed with both Anne and Nicola's comments on how much progress the UK and Australia have made in the last decade. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I'm optimistic.
Okay, and Anne, to you, you've got that global page. You travel a lot.
Yeah,
you do a lot these days.
Of course, I'm hopeful. And why? Because when I flew into Bogota a couple of years ago, the president of Colombia said, I want to open the 30% club here. We've opened in Colombia. We've opened in Mexico. We're opening in Poland. I'm talking to Russia. I think that there is an absolute will to do this. I agree with Nicola. We're seeing changes in the Middle East. To Piyush's comment about female bank CEOs, I met a female bank CEO in the Middle East, and she had been actually recruited as a graduate by a friend of mine who was head of the bank from Citibank as head of Samba, and he had, helped her, sponsored her in her career. And I think there are plenty of people like that on the planet. And by the way, another thing that gives me a lot of hope is as I look at the vaccine development around the world, It was a woman who invented the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It was married couples that did the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. You see many women coming through in the life sciences. And I think that, you know, we can definitely change the number of women engineers in the world. I'm a woman engineer, by the way. So there you go. If I can do it, it must be easy. I've got lots of hope.
Thank you so much. So on that very hopeful note and that very positive note, I want to thank our distinguished panel for sharing your views and perspective on board diversity and female leadership. And Cairns, Nicola, Wakefield, Evans, and of course our male ally, Piyush Gupta. Thank you so much for being so open with the conversation. And I'll now hand it back to Georgette Tan, Chair of BoardAgender in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Geopik, and thank you, our wonderful panelists, Piyush, Nicola, and of course, Anne. What an engaging session, and you know, the questions were coming fast and furious. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I think the discussion certainly covered off many of those points that we were seeing in the questions and through the chats. So thank you so much, all of you, for staying on. It is a little bit past the time of 8:15, but we've had a super engaging conversation. I think one thing is clear. While some progress has been made, I think we're all in agreement more needs to be done. So whether it's government support, it's companies themselves, stock exchanges, asset managers, everybody has to play their part. Male allies, not just allyship, sponsorship, be more active. I love this, active participation. Be right there, jump right in. There are so many things that need to get done. And I also liked what Nicola stated right at the start. It's about reporting. It's about measurement, keeping track of the numbers. That's what keeps us true. So lots of work ahead of us, but as I said at the start, we are only just getting started. Thank you again for joining us. There will be a QR code posted up after this. Please, please, your feedback is important to us. We would love to hear from you. And if there are topics that you'd like us to focus on, or if you'd like to actually reach out and work with us, please let us know. Thank you again for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.